Greenland, the frozen heart of the Arctic. A realm of endless whiteness, bone-chilling storms, and a silence that swallows a man whole. From the surface, one might think only a harsh, unforgiving nature exists here. But beneath this white shroud lies one of the most audacious, dangerous, and perhaps darkest secrets in history. This is the story of humanity's attempt to defy the wildest power of nature by building a hell deep within the ice. The 1950s. The world was trembling with the ice-cold tension of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union stood like a powder keg ready to explode, their nuclear missiles aimed at one another. In this paranoid atmosphere, no idea was considered too mad, especially if it guaranteed the nation's security. It was within this environment, in the corridors of the Pentagon, that a plan was conceived. A plan so extreme it pushed the limits of reason, standing as a marvel of engineering as much as a potential catalyst for the end of humanity. This plan, codenamed Project Iceworm, had a simple yet terrifying objective: to build a secret network of military bases consisting of thousands of kilometers of tunnels deep under the Greenland ice sheet. From here, a sudden and devastating nuclear strike could be launched against the Soviet Union in the event of war. The vision was not just a static base, but a mobile missile network shifting beneath the ice. This meant even enemy spy satellites could never pinpoint the missiles' locations. An invisible army ready to deliver death. A lethal hand reaching out from the heart of the white hell to the other side of the world. However, this massive project needed a face for the public. In the eyes of the Danish government and the international community, it was to be nothing more than scientific research. Named Camp Century, this base was marketed as a city under the ice that would contribute to polar research, climate science, and glaciology. Contrary to the freezing chaos reigning on the surface, it would offer modern city comforts and house scientists. It was a grand illusion, one of the greatest lies history has ever seen. In 1959, the first shovels hit the ice. But this was not excavation as we know it. Using specially designed tunnel boring machines, massive ice saws, and heated pipes, they pushed deep into the ice sheet. The goal was to create a subterranean world carved from the ice itself. While temperatures dropped below -60 and storms reduced visibility to zero, the soldiers and engineers on the surface struggled against incredible odds. Yet, 30 feet below the ice, a different world was taking shape. Whether in the eternal light of the Arctic summer or the total darkness of the winter, this tunnel network promised an isolated life with its own light and energy. This city of the future was, in reality, a cage of ice waiting for the war of the future. This is where Eldermurk opens the doors to stories where truth is stranger than fiction. A story of one of the deepest secrets of the Cold War, a striking example of humanity's war against nature, and the terrifying tale of a time-delayed ecological bomb beginning to resurface with global warming. Are you ready to peel back the layers of this dark secret lying beneath the ice? Welcome to Eldermurk. Here we explore the secrets hidden in the deepest chambers of science, history, and the human spirit. Sometimes the truth itself is more jarring than the most horrific fiction. And we are here to bring those jarring truths to light. Each week, we bring you a new mystery that will take you on a dark journey and make you wonder, what if? Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join the Eldermurk family. Because some stories should never be forgotten. The construction of Camp Century was one of the most challenging engineering feats in human history. Imagine a massive labyrinth carved into the ice. A subterranean city powered by a nuclear reactor, generating its own electricity, purifying fresh water from the ice, and connected by miles of tunnels. This was not just a military base, it was a way of life. Completely isolated from sunlight, detached from the freezing and stormy reality of the outer world. Inside, the temperature was kept constant, and soldiers and scientists lived in their own microclimate, seemingly unaware of the hell on the surface. It had a cinema, a library, a barber shop, and even a small chapel. It was an utopia. But the truth lying beneath this utopia was much more chilling. Camp Century was merely the visible face of a nuclear missile ramp buried under the ice. The real purpose was to host Project Iceworm, the most secret and aggressive part of America's nuclear deterrence strategy. This project envisioned nuclear missiles mounted on railway cars, constantly moving through the massive tunnels built under the ice sheet. In the event of war, these missiles could be brought to the surface from any point in Greenland and launched toward the Soviet Union. This would completely neutralize the Soviet first strike capability and make the threat of retaliation more terrifying than ever. However, the details of this daring plan were hidden even from the Danish government. The ethical dimensions, the moral gray areas, and the potential international consequences were pushed aside. The only goal was to gain superiority over the enemy and guarantee national security. But nature had its own plans. The massive ice sheet of Greenland was not a static, motionless mass. On the contrary, it moved constantly like a giant organism, a few inches a day, sometimes more. This movement created incredible pressure on the tunnels carved into the ice. Engineers had not fully predicted the effects of this dynamic structure. Initially, metal supports and heating systems were used to prevent the tunnels from collapsing under the weight of the ice. But over time, it became clear that the power of nature was far superior to human engineering. Camp Century was, in fact, an experiment where a time bomb was hidden in a box of ice. And the end of this experiment would not bode well for humanity. Project Iceworm was not just a nuclear missile project. It was a symbol of humanity's relationship with nature, its arrogance, and the steps it took without considering the consequences. This secret, buried in the freezing depths of Greenland, would remain out of sight and forgotten for decades. That is, until another threat appeared on the surface of the Earth: global warming. The melting of the glaciers is not just a climate disaster. It is also causing dark secrets like Project Iceworm to surface from beneath the ice, bringing the ghosts of the past to the doorstep of the present. So, how will this toxic legacy lying under the ice drag humanity into the future? The answers are hidden deeper in this story. The year was 1960. While the rest of the world looked toward the stars in a race for space, a small group of hand-picked men was looking downward, into the abyss of the Arctic. They weren't just building a base, they were attempting to sustain life where life was never meant to exist. To do this, they needed power. Not just ordinary power, but something that could burn for years without the need for constant refueling in the most inaccessible place on Earth. The solution was as brilliant as it was terrifying: the PM2A, the world's first portable nuclear power plant. Imagine the scene: a massive humming nuclear reactor, transported in pieces across the treacherous ice cap and reassembled deep inside a hand-carved ice cavern. This was the beating heart of Camp Century. It provided the electricity to light the tunnels, the heat to keep the men from freezing, and the power to melt thousands of tons of ice into drinking water. But it also brought a silent, invisible tension. These men were living, eating, and sleeping just a few dozen feet away from a live nuclear core, encased in nothing but a shell of steel and the very ice that was slowly, inevitably moving around them. The hum of the reactor became the soundtrack of their lives, a constant reminder that they were tethered to a sun made by human hands, buried in a tomb of frost. Life inside the tunnels was a surreal blend of military discipline and psychological endurance. The main street of Camp Century was a tunnel over 1,000 feet long, lined with prefabricated wooden buildings that housed laboratories, barracks, and even a hospital. To a casual observer, it might have looked like a futuristic frontier town. But the reality was far more taxing. There was no sun, no wind, no smell of earth or rain. Only the sterile, recycled air and the pale glow of fluorescent lights. Time began to lose its meaning. The distinction between day and night evaporated, replaced by the rigid schedule of the military clock. The psychological toll on the residents of Camp Century, the Iceworms, as they called themselves, was a study in isolation. They were the pioneers of a new kind of existence, but they were also guinea pigs. The military monitored everything: how they slept, how they interacted, and how the crushing weight of the ice above affected their minds. Every creak of the ice walls, every groan of the wooden supports, felt like the mountain was whispering a warning. They were guests in a realm that did not want them there. And while the surface world saw photos of smiling soldiers in the base's bowling alley, the journals of the men told a different story, one of growing anxiety and the feeling of being buried alive. But while the soldiers focused on survival and sanity, the higher-ups were focused on the trenching. This was the true work of Project Iceworm. Miles away from the comfortable barracks of Camp Century, specialized crews were testing the feasibility of the Great Plan. They were cutting deep, narrow trenches into the ice, miles long, testing if the heavy Minuteman missiles could truly be transported on rails beneath the surface. They found that the ice was surprisingly easy to carve, but impossible to tame. The walls would deform. The floors would rise. The very geometry of the tunnels changed by the hour. It was a race against a glacier that was trying to swallow their tracks as fast as they could lay them. This struggle between human ambition and the shifting ice was the beginning of the end for the project's secrecy. The technical challenges were mounting, and with them the risk of a catastrophic failure. If the ice crushed the reactor, or if a missile was trapped in a collapsing tunnel, the scientific cover story would evaporate instantly. The Pentagon was beginning to realize that they hadn't just built a base. They had entered into a long-term siege with an enemy that never tired and never retreated, the Greenland ice sheet. As the 1960s progressed, Camp Century became a marvel of propaganda. The U.S. Army released films showing soldiers in crisp uniforms, enjoying hot meals and reading in well-stocked libraries, all while a blizzard raged hundreds of feet above their heads. They called it the City Under the Ice, a testament to American ingenuity and a beacon of hope for a future where even the most hostile environments could be conquered. But for those deep in the trenches, the city was a labyrinth of secrets. The deeper you went into the tunnel system, the further you moved away from the scientific laboratories and the closer you got to the true heart of Project Iceworm. The technical scale of the project was staggering. The plan required the excavation of over 2,500 miles of tunnels, a distance greater than the width of the United States itself. These weren't just small crawl spaces. They were massive, vaulted corridors designed to accommodate heavy machinery and eventually the railway-mounted Minuteman missiles. To achieve this, the Army utilized a technique called cut and cover. Giant Swiss-made milling machines would chew through the packed snow and ice, creating a deep trench. Then, a corrugated steel arch was placed over the top, and the excavated snow was blown back over the arch. Within hours, the Arctic wind would freeze the snow into a rock-hard crust, leaving a permanent hollowed-out vein in the glacier. But there was a problem that no one dared to speak of loudly: the ice was alive. Glaciologists at the base, many of whom were kept in the dark about the missiles, began to notice troubling data. The Greenland ice sheet wasn't a solid block. It was a slow-moving river of frozen water, flowing toward the sea under its own immense weight. The tunnels weren't staying put. They were twisting. The floors were heaving upward as the pressure from the sides squeezed the hollow spaces. In some sections, the walls were closing in at a rate of several inches per month. The engineers found themselves in a surreal battle, constantly shaving the walls of the tunnels with chainsaws just to keep the paths open for the supply sleds. It was a Sisyphean task. The more they carved, the more the ice seemed to react, pushing back against the intruders. Amidst this geological struggle, the military's top-secret work continued in the furthest reaches of the complex. This was where the missile rail systems were being tested. The vision was a nuclear ghost train. Hundreds of missiles would be constantly in motion, moving from one launch point to another across a vast, invisible grid. If the Soviet Union ever launched a first strike, they would be aiming at a frozen wasteland, while the American response would come from a location that changed every hour. It was a strategy of total invisibility, but it required a level of precision that the shifting ice simply would not allow. The atmosphere in these deeper tunnels was markedly different from the cozy barracks of Main Street. Here the air was thinner, the smell of diesel and ozone from the machinery was thick, and the silence was heavy. The men working here knew they weren't just conducting weather research. They were prepping a battlefield. The psychological weight of this knowledge, combined with the physical sensation of millions of tons of ice pressing down from every direction, created a unique form of ice fever. Men began to report strange auditory hallucinations, the sound of footsteps in empty tunnels, or the feeling of being watched by something within the ice itself. Was it just the isolation, or was the project tapping into something that should have remained buried? As the tunnels grew longer and the nuclear reactor hummed deeper into the night, the line between a military triumph and a descent into madness began to blur. The city under the ice was thriving on the surface of public opinion, but in the dark, frozen veins of the glacier, the first cracks, both in the ice and in the plan, were starting to show. At the very center of this frozen fortress sat the PM-2A nuclear reactor, a marvel of atomic-age technology, but also a source of quiet, radiating dread. It was the first of its kind, a modular power plant designed to be the Prometheus of the Arctic. It provided the lifeblood of Camp Century, heat and light. But in the confined, echo-filled tunnels of a glacier, the presence of a nuclear core felt less like a scientific triumph and more like a sleeping dragon. The soldiers assigned to the reactor room lived under a cloud of invisible anxiety. They wore radiation dosimeters like talismans, constantly checking the levels, knowing that if something went wrong there was nowhere to run. They were trapped in a box of ice with a sun that could turn into a supernova at any moment. The cooling system of the reactor presented a nightmare of its own. It required massive amounts of water, which was obtained by melting the surrounding ice. This created huge, hollowed-out caverns beneath the base, voids that were never part of the original structural plan. As the water was extracted, the integrity of the ice above began to falter. The soldiers began to hear it, the thundering. It was the sound of the glacier groaning as it settled into the empty spaces created by the humans. It was a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the soles of their boots, a reminder that they were hollowing out their own foundations. Meanwhile, the ice fever was spreading. The medical officers at Camp Century began to document a rise in peculiar symptoms among the crew. It wasn't just the lack of vitamin D or the isolation. It was a sensory deprivation so profound that the brain began to invent its own reality. Some men claimed they could hear the whispers of the frost, low-frequency vibrations caused by the moving ice that sounded eerily like human voices. Others became obsessed with the Blue Room, a legendary, unauthorized tunnel that some claimed led to a part of the glacier that had been frozen for 100,000 years, containing things not meant for human eyes. The psychological pressure was compounded by the growing realization that the mission was failing. The shaving of the tunnels, once a routine maintenance task, had become an all-consuming war. The ice was moving faster than the engineers had predicted. Huge steel beams, designed to hold back the weight of the world, were being twisted like pipe cleaners. The ceilings of the missile trenches were sagging, threatening to trap the very weapons that were supposed to protect the nation. The nuclear ghost train was becoming a stationary target, a prisoner of the very environment that was supposed to hide it. By 1963, the cracks were no longer metaphorical. They were physical, jagged fissures appearing in the walls of the reactor room itself. The heat from the reactor was melting its own support structure, causing the core to slowly sink into the ice. It was a race against time. If the reactor tilted too far, the cooling pipes would snap, and a meltdown in the middle of the Greenland ice cap would become a horrific reality. The scientists who had been brought in for research were now the ones sounding the alarm. They realized that the city under the ice was not a permanent colony, but a sinking ship. The atmosphere at the base shifted from one of pioneering excitement to one of grim survivalism. The secrecy of Project Iceworm became a burden. Because the world didn't know the true extent of what was being built, they couldn't understand the magnitude of the danger. The men of Camp Century were alone, 130 miles from the nearest civilization, living on top of a failing nuclear heart, inside a glacier that was trying to crush them into oblivion. The dream of the Arctic fortress was dying, and in its place, a nightmare of radiation and ice was taking hold. By 1964, the high command at the Pentagon had to face a bitter, cold reality. The city under the ice was being defeated, not by a Soviet strike or a failure of technology, but by the slow, agonizing crawl of the Earth itself. The Greenland ice sheet was winning the war of attrition. The tunnels, which had cost millions of dollars and thousands of hours of back-breaking labor, were becoming death traps. The twisted steel arches and the sagging ceilings were no longer just maintenance issues. They were signs of an imminent structural collapse. The dream of a 1,000-mile nuclear railway was dead. The decision to decommission the nuclear reactor was the first domino to fall. The PM-2A, the humming heart that had sustained the base for years, was shut down. The process was a logistical nightmare. It had to be dismantled in the same way it was brought in, piece by piece, and hauled across the treacherous ice cap back to the coast. As the reactor was removed, the warmth began to fade from the tunnels. The main street, that once felt like a futuristic outpost, suddenly felt like a tomb. The fluorescent lights were replaced by the dim, flickering glow of emergency generators, and the silence that followed the reactor's hum was more terrifying than the noise had ever been. In 1966, the order for a total evacuation was issued. The iceworms were going home. But the departure was not a grand ceremony, it was a hurried retreat. The military logic of the time was chillingly simple: the ice would protect their secrets. They believed that as the base was abandoned, the shifting snow and ice would bury everything: the diesel fuel, the chemical waste, the radioactive runoff from the reactor, and keep it frozen forever. They thought they were burying their mistakes in a vault that would never be opened. As the last sleds pulled away from the entrance of Camp Century, the men looked back at a landscape that showed almost no sign of the massive city beneath it. Only a few ventilation shafts and a lonely weather station remained on the surface. Below them, miles of tunnels, wooden buildings, and tons of toxic legacy were left to the darkness. The doors were not just locked, they were sealed by the frost. The base was officially deactivated, but it was far from dead. It was a ghost city, waiting in the dark, slowly being crushed and reshaped by the glacier. For the next few decades, Camp Century became a footnote in Cold War history, a classified memory that few spoke of. The soldiers went back to their lives, sworn to secrecy about the true nature of Project Iceworm. The Danish government was told the base was simply no longer needed for scientific research. The world moved on to the space race and the Vietnam War, forgetting that deep beneath the Arctic, a radioactive time bomb had been planted. But nature has a way of refusing to keep our secrets. While the Pentagon assumed the ice would grow thicker and bury the waste deeper, the planet was beginning to change in ways they hadn't planned for. The perpetual frost was not as perpetual as they thought. The secrets of Camp Century were about to enter a new, much more dangerous phase, one where the ice would no longer act as a shield, but as a messenger of forgotten sins. The retreat was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. For years, a heavy, frozen silence fell over the coordinates of Camp Century. To the world above, the site was nothing more than a featureless expanse of white, indistinguishable from the rest of the Greenland wilderness. But beneath the surface, a slow-motion catastrophe was unfolding. The military had assumed that the ice would act as a permanent tomb, a static vault that would keep their toxic legacy isolated from the biosphere for tens of thousands of years. They were wrong. They had treated the glacier as a graveyard, but the glacier was a living, moving, and breathing entity. Inside the abandoned tunnels, the laws of physics were working with brutal efficiency. Without the constant heat from the reactor and the maintenance crews to shave the walls, the ice began to reclaim its territory with a vengeance. The wooden barracks, once filled with the sounds of soldiers laughing and the clatter of typewriters, were slowly crushed. The ceilings met the floors, snapping thick timber beams like toothpicks. The cinema, the chapel, the laboratories, all of it was being flattened into a thin layer of debris pressed between gigatons of ancient ice. But it wasn't just wood and steel that remained. Left behind in the spirit of convenience were massive quantities of hazardous materials. Tens of thousands of liters of diesel fuel remained in leaching tanks. Unknown quantities of PCB, a highly toxic chemical used in fluids and paints, were scattered throughout the complex. And most ominously, there were the remnants of the nuclear era: radioactive coolant water and waste that had been dumped into sumps in the ice, under the assumption they would remain frozen forever. In the 1970s and 80s, Project Iceworm became a black site, in the truest sense. It existed only in classified filing cabinets and in the fading memories of the men who had served there. The political landscape had changed, the Cold War was entering new phases, and the idea of a nuclear ghost train under the ice seemed like a fever dream from a more paranoid era. However, the physical reality of the waste didn't care about politics. It sat there, deep in the dark, a concentrated pocket of man-made poison waiting for a change in the environment. The chilling part of this period was the lack of monitoring. Because the base was permanently sealed, no one was checking if the containers were leaking. No one was measuring if the radioactive isotopes were migrating through the ice. The US and Denmark had entered into a comfortable state of mutual amnesia. As long as the ice stayed thick and the secret stayed buried, the liability didn't exist. But the Earth was beginning to warm. The stable climate that had existed since the end of the last ice age was shifting. What the architects of Project Iceworm never considered was the albedo effect and the accelerating rate of Arctic melt. They built their base on the assumption of a static future. But as the decades passed, the vault was no longer being buried deeper by new snow. Instead, the old layers were beginning to thin. The ghost of Camp Century was no longer sinking. It was slowly, inch by inch, rising toward the surface. The sins of the Cold War were about to meet the reality of the 21st century, and the world was completely unprepared for what was about to emerge from the thaw. As the turn of the millennium approached, a new kind of explorer began to haunt the vicinity of the abandoned Camp Century. These were not soldiers or secret agents, but climate scientists equipped with satellite imagery and deep core radar. What they found beneath the pristine white surface was not just a historical curiosity, but a sprawling 55-hectare scar of industrial and radioactive waste. The city under the ice was no longer a myth or a classified rumor. It was a measurable physical threat. In 2016, a landmark study sent shockwaves through the scientific community and the halls of international diplomacy. The data was undeniable. The Greenland ice sheet was melting at a rate far exceeding the most pessimistic models of the 1960s. The assumption that the waste at Camp Century would be eternally buried was officially declared a fallacy. Researchers estimated that within 75 years, perhaps even sooner, the ice covering the base would begin to melt from the top down. This was the moment the ghost of Project Iceworm truly woke up. The world suddenly realized that when the ice turned to water, it wouldn't just be an environmental change, it would be a delivery system. The thousands of tons of diesel fuel, the carcinogenic PCBs, and the radioactive isotopes would be carried by the meltwater directly into the North Atlantic Ocean. One of the most pristine ecosystems on the planet was facing a delayed onset poisoning from a war that ended decades ago. The political fallout was immediate and bitter. Greenland, now enjoying a high degree of autonomy from Denmark, looked toward Copenhagen and Washington with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Who was responsible for the cleanup? The United States, who built the ticking bomb? Denmark, who authorized the scientific base while looking the other way? Or Greenland, who inherited the land but never the secrets? The legal gray zone that the military had exploited in 1959 had become a diplomatic battlefield. But while the politicians argued over liability, the physical reality was growing more ominous. Ground-penetrating radar revealed that the internal structures of the base, the collapsed tunnels and crushed buildings, were acting like a giant sponge, holding the concentrated toxins in a localized area. However, as the surrounding ice softened, those toxins were beginning to migrate. The nuclear heart was no longer beating, but it was leaking. For the locals in Greenland, the news was a betrayal of the land itself. For generations, the ice had been a source of life, a sacred part of their identity. To learn that a foreign power had used it as a dumping ground for nuclear waste felt like a violation of the Earth. The ice fever that had plagued the soldiers in the 60s had been replaced by a toxic anxiety that gripped the modern population. They weren't just watching the ice melt, they were watching a nightmare emerge from the frost, one that they had no power to stop. The story of Camp Century was no longer about Cold War ingenuity. It had become a cautionary tale about the permanence of human waste and the arrogance of thinking we can ever truly bury our mistakes. The ice was no longer a protector of secrets, it was a melting witness, prepared to testify against the hubris of the past. Imagine a city that was never meant to be seen again, a place where the clock stopped in 1967, now slowly being exhaled by the Earth. This is the current state of Camp Century. It has become what researchers call a zombie base, a dead structure that refused to stay buried. As the surface layers of snow and ice thin due to the relentless warming of the Arctic, the physical reality of what was left behind is becoming terrifyingly clear. We are no longer talking about abstract data on a scientist's map. We are talking about a massive, industrial corpse rising from its grave. Recent subsurface imaging and remote sensing have revealed a haunting architecture of decay. The once grand Main Street tunnel where soldiers once walked to the cinema is now a jagged, frozen scar. The wooden buildings haven't just rotted. The extreme pressure of the glacier has flattened them into thin ribbons of debris, creating a subterranean layer of human strata sandwiched between layers of ice that are thousands of years old. In these ruins lie thousands of artifacts of a forgotten daily life, half-read magazines, rusted cans of food, tools, and personal effects of men who thought they were building the future. But the most chilling aspect of this resurrection is the behavior of the waste. For decades, it was assumed that the diesel and the radioactive isotopes were frozen in place, as if trapped in amber. But the new reality of the Greenland ice sheet is one of internal plumbing. As the climate warms, meltwater from the surface filters down through the cracks in the ice, creating hidden rivers and lakes deep within the glacier. This water is now coming into contact with the Camp Century ruins. It is washing over the rusted fuel tanks. It is soaking into the PCB-laden paints. It is mingling with the radioactive sumps. This creates a toxic cocktail that is much harder to contain than solid waste. The water doesn't just sit there, it migrates. It follows the path of least resistance, carving new channels through the ice. The ghost of Project Iceworm is literally beginning to flow. Scientists are now racing to map these hidden arteries of the glacier, fearing that the poison could reach the coast much faster than originally predicted. The vault has been breached from the inside out. There is also a profound psychological shift occurring in how we view the Arctic. For centuries, the North was seen as the ultimate wilderness, a place of purity and infinite renewal. Camp Century has shattered that illusion. It stands as proof that there is no place on Earth, no matter how remote, no matter how frozen, that is safe from human interference. The zombie base is a reminder that our industrial footprints are permanent, even when we try to hide them under 2 miles of ice. As the physical remains of the base continue to rise toward the light, the question of what to do becomes more urgent every day. You cannot simply dig up a city that is crushed under millions of tons of shifting ice without risking a catastrophic release of the very toxins you are trying to remove. We are trapped in a paradox. Leaving it there is a disaster, but trying to take it out might be worse. The men of the Cold War created a problem that the modern world simply does not have the technology or the money to solve. The nuclear ghost has finally come home to haunt us. While the world above was preoccupied with the geopolitical chess match of the Cold War, a different kind of battle was being fought inside the minds of the men stationed at Camp Century. To spend months hundreds of feet beneath the ice, in a world where the sun never rises and the only sound is the mechanical hum of a nuclear reactor, does something to the human psyche. The soldiers and scientists who called themselves iceworms were the subjects of an unintentional psychological experiment. They were living in a sensory vacuum, a place where the boundaries between reality and hallucination began to freeze and crack. The military medical officers documented a phenomenon they called ice fever. It started with simple irritability and sleep disorders, but in the depths of the long Arctic night, it evolved into something much more sinister. In the sterile, recycled air of the tunnels, men began to lose their grip on time. Some reported seeing shadows moving in the periphery of the unlit service tunnels, areas where no human was supposed to be. Others became obsessed with the sound of the ice. They claimed that if you listened closely enough to the walls, you could hear the glacier talking. Not just the groans of shifting weight, but rhythmic, almost melodic whispers that seemed to call out their names. The architecture of the base itself contributed to this descent into paranoia. The tunnels were designed for efficiency, but their repetitive, curving nature created a sense of being trapped in a never-ending loop. Every corridor looked like the last. The main street was the only semblance of civilization, but even there, the knowledge that millions of tons of ice were pressing down from above created a constant, low-level claustrophobia. For some, the fear wasn't that the ice would collapse, but that it would simply swallow them. That the base would be forgotten while they were still inside, leaving them to become part of the geological record, frozen in mid-stride. One of the most classified aspects of the Camp Century journals involves the voids. As the heat from the nuclear reactor and the living quarters melted the surrounding ice, it created massive, unintended caverns, dark, hollow spaces that stretched out into the blackness. Soldiers assigned to inspect these voids reported a sense of cosmic dread. In the beam of their flashlights, the ice didn't look like frozen water. It looked like a vast, ancient consciousness that was slowly reacting to their presence. There are unverified accounts of men refusing to enter certain sectors of the base, claiming that the atmosphere had turned hostile, as if the Earth itself was rejecting the nuclear heart they had forced into its side. This psychological decay was perhaps the real reason the project was abandoned so readily. The technical failures of the shifting ice were undeniable, but the human element was failing just as fast. The Pentagon realized that even if they could stabilize the tunnels, they couldn't stabilize the men. You could build a city under the ice, but you couldn't build a home there. The nuclear ghost train required operators who were sharp and focused, but the Arctic was turning them into ghosts themselves. When the evacuation finally came, many of the men felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering trauma. They returned to the surface world, but they carried the silence of the tunnels with them. For decades they remained silent, bound by their oaths of secrecy. But in their nightmares, they were back in the blue-tinted darkness, hearing the hum of the PM2A and the slow, inevitable grinding of the ice. They knew what the world is only now discovering, that some places are not meant for us, and when we intrude upon them, they leave a mark on our souls that never truly thaws. As the physical ice thinned, the political ice between nations began to thicken. The revelation of Project Iceworm's true nature and its toxic remains created a sovereignty nightmare that remains unresolved to this day. When the U.S. Army packed its bags in 1967, they relied on a 1951 defense treaty with Denmark. But there was a catch, a lie of omission that now haunts the halls of international law. The treaty allowed for military facilities, but it never explicitly authorized the permanent disposal of nuclear waste or the secret deployment of 600 nuclear missiles. This has led to a three-way standoff of blame. Greenland, having gained significant autonomy, argues that they were never consulted and that their land was treated as a colonial dumping ground. They demand a full cleanup, estimated to cost billions of dollars, money the small nation does not have. Denmark, caught in the middle, faces the reality that they may have been complicit by not asking enough questions during the Cold War. And the United States maintains a complex legal stance. Since the base was officially closed, and the treaty didn't specify cleanup protocols for abandoned sites, they technically fulfilled their obligations. But the nuclear ghost doesn't care about legal loopholes. While the lawyers argue, the isotopes continue their slow migration. This is the new face of the Cold War. Not a battle of ideologies but a battle of liabilities. The secrecy that once protected the project is now the very thing that makes solving it impossible. Because the exact location and contents of every waste sump were not meticulously recorded, or those records were destroyed, any cleanup operation would be like performing surgery on a patient while blindfolded. One wrong move, one accidental breach of a pressurized tank, and the limited leak could become a regional catastrophe. The situation at Camp Century has become a chilling precedent for other black sites around the world. From abandoned Soviet biological weapon labs on disappearing islands in the Aral Sea to sunken nuclear submarines in the Barents, the world is littered with the debris of 20th century paranoia. Camp Century, however, is unique because its vault is the very thing the entire world is watching: the melting polar ice. It has become a symbol of environmental blowback. The idea that the secrets we bury today will eventually be vomited back up by a planet that is no longer stable. The local Inuit populations who have survived in the Arctic for millennia by reading the ice, now look at the horizon with a new kind of fear. They know the ice is changing, but they also know that the American city buried beneath it is a different kind of predator. It's a predator made of chemicals and radiation that they cannot see, smell, or hunt. To them, the diplomatic deadlock is not just a political issue. It is a slow-motion invasion of their future. The question remains, who pays the price when the ice finally gives way? As the sun sets on the era of Arctic stability, the shadow of Camp Century grows longer. The diplomats can delay their meetings and the lawyers can file their motions, but the physical reality of the nuclear heart is moving at its own pace, a pace dictated by the warming air and the softening frost. The reckoning is coming, and it is coming in the form of water. We are now approaching the endgame. For decades, the story of Camp Century was a ghost story, a legend of things buried and forgotten. But as we look toward the middle of this century, the legend is turning into a blueprint for disaster. What happens when the vault finally opens? Scientists have run the simulations, and the results are a chilling reminder of why some secrets should never have been created. We are looking at a process called surface ablation, the point where the rate of melting on the top of the glacier exceeds the snowfall on top. When this threshold is crossed, the tomb of Project Iceworm will no longer be subterranean. It will be an open wound on the face of the Earth. The first thing to emerge won't be the steel beams or the wooden barracks. It will be the plume. As the ice surrounding the ruins turns to liquid, it will mobilize the thousands of tons of diesel fuel and PCBs that have been concentrated in a small area for 70 years. This toxic slurry will not simply sit on the surface. It will follow the natural drainage basins of the Greenland ice sheet, flowing into the moulins, deep, vertical shafts that lead directly to the base of the glacier. From there, the poison enters the subglacial plumbing system, a network of hidden rivers that dump directly into the North Atlantic. This is where the local secret becomes a global crisis. The North Atlantic is the engine room of the world's oceans. It is the site of the Great Ocean Conveyor Belt, the current that regulates the climate of the entire planet. Injecting thousands of tons of non-biodegradable chemicals and radioactive isotopes into this specific point is like injecting poison directly into the heart of a living being. The impact on the fishing grounds of the North, the primary food source for millions, could be catastrophic. We are not just talking about a few miles of polluted coastline, we are talking about a bioaccumulative nightmare that could climb the food chain from plankton to whales, and eventually to the human dinner table. And then there is the radiation. While most of the high-level waste was removed, the low-level radioactive soil and coolant water remain. In a frozen state, these isotopes are manageable. In a liquid state, they are invisible killers. As they enter the ocean, they will be dispersed by the currents, making it impossible to clean up or contain. The legacy of a 1960s military project will effectively become a permanent part of the Earth's hydrosphere. The nuclear ghost will no longer be a story told in the dark. It will be a measurable reality in every drop of seawater. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Great Thaw is the realization of our own helplessness. To prevent this, we would need to excavate the entire site now, while the ice is still relatively stable. But the logistics of such an operation are beyond anything humanity has ever attempted. It would require building a massive climate-controlled mining operation in the middle of a shifting glacier hundreds of miles from help, at a cost that would bankrupt most nations. We are watching a slow-motion train wreck, and we have realized too late that we have no brakes. As the Arctic summer grows longer and the white expanses turn to gray and blue, the zombie base of Camp Century is preparing for its final act. It is a testament to the fact that in the war between human technology and the Earth doesn't just win, it outlasts. The nuclear heart was a gamble that the future would be exactly like the past. But the future is arriving, and it is bringing the ghosts of the Cold War with it, washed in the radioactive meltwater of a dying glacier. As the ruins of Camp Century rise toward the light, the world is forced to ask a chilling question. Did we actually learn anything? The tragedy of Project Iceworm is not just a story of melting ice and leaking radiation. It is a mirror reflecting our own current obsession with power. Today, the Arctic is no longer a forgotten wasteland. It has once again become the most contested territory on the planet. As the ice disappears, new shipping lanes open and vast, untapped reserves of oil and minerals become accessible. The nuclear ghost of the 1960s has been replaced by a new high-tech scramble for the frozen throne. In the secret briefing rooms of modern superpowers, the maps of Greenland and the Arctic Circle are being unrolled once again. This time, the technology is more advanced. Autonomous underwater drones, satellite-guided hypersonic missiles, and deep-sea mining rigs. But the mindset remains dangerously similar to the one that conceived Project Iceworm. The belief that nature can be managed, that risks can be calculated, and that the consequences can be buried, is still the dominant logic. We are witnessing a sequel to the Cold War, and the stage is the same melting ice that is currently trying to vomit up our past mistakes. There are rumors, the kind of whispers that Eldermurk was built to investigate, that Camp Century was not the only black site in the north. Some whistleblowers and former military contractors suggest that deeper in the interior, in places where the ice is still thick, newer projects are being developed. Projects that use the lessons of the 1960s not to prevent disaster, but to hide it better. Under the guise of climate monitoring or global telecommunications, are we once again hollowing out the earth to house the instruments of our own destruction? The irony is profound. We are using the very climate change caused by our industrial hubris to access new ways to continue that same hubris. The melting of Camp Century should be a final warning, a screaming alarm from the earth itself. Instead, it is being treated as a logistical hurdle in the way of the next great resource grab. The ice fever has returned, but this time it isn't just affecting a few hundred soldiers in a tunnel. It has infected the entire global geopolitical system. What will the explorers of the year 2100 find when they look beneath the waves of an ice-free Arctic? Will they find the rusted remains of Camp Century, floating in a sea of its own toxins? Or will they find the ruins of our own era, newer, more complex ghost cities that we are building right now, thinking we have finally mastered the frost? The story of Project Iceworm is a closed loop, a warning that is being ignored as it is being revealed. The nuclear heart of the 1960s was a gamble on permanence in a world of change. Today we are gambling on the change itself, betting that we can survive the fallout of our own history. But as the dark water begins to lap at the crushed wooden doors of the old base, the truth is becoming undeniable. The ice never forgot. It was never a tomb. It was a witness. And now, its testimony is about to be delivered to a world that is still too busy fighting over the throne to notice the rising tide. We have reached the end of the tunnels. The story of Camp Century and Project Iceworm is more than just a forgotten chapter of the Cold War. It is a profound testament to the limits of human ambition and the terrifying endurance of our mistakes. For nearly 70 years, we believed we could bury our darkest intentions in the deepest frost, trusting the silence of the Arctic to keep our secrets forever. But the silence is breaking. The ice is speaking. And what it has to say is a warning for all of humanity. As the sun sets over the shifting Greenland ice sheet, the nuclear heart continues its slow, inevitable ascent. It stands as a monument to a time when we thought we could conquer nature with the atom, only to find that nature is the ultimate auditor, one that eventually collects every debt. The city under the ice was never just a base, it was a mirror. It reflected our brilliance, our bravery, and our absolute, staggering arrogance. Today, as the toxic meltwater begins its journey toward the sea, that mirror is being shattered, and the shards are falling on our own doorstep. We must ask ourselves, what else is waiting in the dark? What other ice worms have we planted in the deserts, the oceans, and the forests of our world? History is not a straight line, it is a cycle of echoes. And if we listen closely to the groaning of the glaciers, we can hear the echoes of every secret we ever tried to hide. The ghost of Camp Century is not just a remnant of the past, it is a premonition of our future, a future where the earth no longer hides what we refuse to face. The ice is melting, the secrets are rising, and the clock is ticking. The story of the nuclear ghost is a chilling reminder that the things we bury rarely stay dead. But what do you think? Is the rising tide of Camp Century an inevitable disaster, or is there still time to disarm the ticking bomb of the past? And more importantly, what other secrets are currently thawing out in the remote corners of our planet? Let us know your theories in the comments below. If this journey into the frozen labyrinth has kept you awake, make sure to strike that like button and subscribe to Eldermurk. We travel where others fear to tread, uncovering the truths that were never meant to see the light of day. Join our community of seekers and turn on notifications so you never miss a descent into the unknown. Remember, the dark doesn't hide things. It only waits for the light to fade. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and we will see you in the next mystery.